Thank you, Gautam. Thanks to the organizers. Mitrani, guten Abend. Smaranti Kila, Gatavarshe Avadam, Prajatnang Karavama Yat Etasa Samelesya Karyakramang, Sanskrit Bhashayang Bhavishyati. Parantu Adyapi Pratikshassu. Ataha, guten Abend. Having said that, good afternoon. Thanks to the organizers for having invited me. I'm not very sure why I've been asked to speak on this topic, because this topic is really the Honorable Minister's topic, or at least part of the time. Nonetheless, since I've been asked to, I will make some remarks. And those remarks are not going to be as fancy as the title of the talk suggests, namely Global Maladies and Remedies. Instead, almost in bulleted fashion, I will articulate some thoughts on what is happening around the globe and where Bharat stands in that context. In the immediate period following the Second World War, when Bharat attained independence, when textbooks were written, and those were textbooks that Gautam and I studied in our respective colleges and subsequently taught when we had generations of students, the general diagnosis was there are the haves of the world, those are the developed countries, and there are the have-nots of the world, those are the developing countries. Initially, they used to be called underdeveloped, which was not terribly polite, so they began to be called developing. And that's the way it was. There were the haves and there were the have-nots, and it would take generations for the have-nots of the world to catch up with the developed countries. Things began to change, particularly in the 60s and certainly in the 70s and the 80s, when we learned that you did not have to wait for generations to lift countries out of poverty and deprivation. In hindsight, the development decades of the 60s and the 70s were lost development decades for Bharat, whereas several countries in East Asia developed and prospered. Why am I saying this? The reason I am saying this is the meat and is the stuff that the Honorable Commerce Minister's negotiations represent quite often, which is today, if you look at the structure of the globe, and the structure of negotiations, whether it is multilateral or whether it is bilateral or whether it is of any other variety, regional, let us say, it is the developed countries which have generally turned protectionist. The developed countries which we used to preach liberalization to us are the ones which are now protectionist. So that's the first point to note, particularly in trade negotiations. Every once in a while, people in India, in Bharat, still get somewhat upset when the USTR produces a national trade estimates report and says these are the problems with India. I have always wondered, and I'm submitting it to the Commerce Minister who's present here, why the Commerce Ministry in India or some other organization in Bharat does not also annually produce a trade estimates report documenting the kinds of barriers that exporters from Bharat confront in the developed countries in North America and in Western Europe. The second point to note is in terms of global structures, and I'm not talking here about the Security Council, particularly I'm talking about structures like the IMF, the IBRD, the World Bank, and assorted other institutions. These were fashioned largely consequent to the Bretton Woods Conference, and these Bretton Woods Conference institutions still do not reflect the reality that the world has changed. The world has changed for the developing countries. The world has changed so far as Bharat is concerned, and certainly China. And the world has also now begun to change for sub-Saharan Africa, with many countries increasingly moving out of what is called the LDC status. The power structures still do not reflect that altered global reality. Yes, there is G20 in which Bharat has obtained recognition, but G20 is sort of quasi-formal. It is still not exactly a formal institution. It does not have a permanent secretariat. So somewhere down the line, as I mentioned, organizations like the IMF and the World Bank will also have to change. The third point I want to make is in this world, which is increasingly a globalized world, it's increasingly a liberalized world, globalization and liberalization mean greater competition. In a world of competition, those who are efficient and competitive survive. Those who are inefficient and uncompetitive have to close down their enterprises, and no tears need be shed for them. Having said that, competitiveness in the global world does not only depend on external circumstances. It does not only depend on demand factors. It does not only depend on the exchange rate. It also depends on what Surjit would call the supply side. And the supply side in Bharat is obstructed and constrained by a host of constraints that anyone who is an exporter here knows about. Some of them have to do with physical infrastructure like roads, ports, electricity. Some of those have to do with indirect tax structures. Some of those have to do with interest rate structures. Some of those have to do with procedures, including customs procedures. So until the domestic environment changes, it is completely unrealistic to expect an Indian exporter, particularly of goods, to survive in the global competitive market. This is where the issue of liberalization and reforms domestically comes in. And what I quickly want to flag for you is when I said those development decades of the 60s and the 70s were lost, I almost tended to suggest that that was benign. It was not benign, it was positively malign, because I can give you a long list of heavy-handed government intervention which plagued Bharat's economy, and the consequences of which we are still suffering as a legacy. Some of those got removed in the period since 1991, but some of those got accentuated in the period since 2004. If you look at competitiveness, for a country like Bharat, competitiveness essentially depends not just on productivity and technology, but also the efficient usage of what economists call factor markets, input markets. land, labor, capital. In all of these three, I can cite instances to you where heavy-handed government intervention has made it worse since 2004. So the task for the new government is not just to ensure what is benign, but also to ensure removal of what has been malign. It is only then that Bharat will be able to occupy its rightful share in the world economy, and I don't have to repeat to an audience like this the Angus Madison kinds of figures of what the shares used to be once upon a time. Perhaps the last sentence that I want to say is, if one looks at classic Hindu economic thought as represented in Kautilya's Arthashastra, or as represented in sections from the Mahabharata, Hindu enterprise did not depend on governments. Many of the things today we associate with government delivery were not items that were delivered by the government. Traditionally, that's not been the case. And even today, if we can ensure that the government or the state gets out of the way, I personally am confident that Bharat's economy and Bharat's enterprise will do exceedingly, exceedingly well. Thank you very much.